You have to have a certificate by a particular issuer. So if you need to have a particular certificate by like yahoo.com, you know, you guys actually, you know, the balls are there if you can't get a word in edgewise. And I haven't seen like a hand raised or somebody try to be like, hey, sure. An actual question, okay.
The question is, if we apply these privileges across these different granularities, does it have either an impact on the performance of the system, or is there any kind of information disclosure that comes from running up against one of these? You're granted this but not granted that, and it acts differently. So it's sort of a two-part.
Great. So it's a two-part question. I'm going to name the two parts because then if I forget it, you all can remind me as opposed to just one person reminding me. The first part was, is there any impact on performance when you grant things? The second part, is there any information disclosure? You know, kind of like if you put in a username and password and it says password isn't good, and then you type in a bad username, does it say like, well, username is not good? There is some information. It will say you don't have permissions to access this table or this database, but it will say that whether or not it exists. If you have access to like an entire database and you try the users table, it will say user table doesn't exist. But if you don't have access to it, if you try to like go to, you know, important information .user, it will say, you know, you don't have privileges to that. And the databases, I believe, I'm not completely sure about all of them, but I believe they differ in whether or not they actually disclose whether the database exists and you don't have permission or not. I know MySQL will be like, nope, you don't have permission, as opposed to, nope, it doesn't exist, or you don't have any permission. And then that was the second part. The first part was, does it have impact on performance?
So when you start granting this and that and the other, you've got this huge matrix of who can see what, at what point does it degrade the performance of the system itself?
It does. I don't know about the other database systems. MySQL keeps a system table in memory. I mean, it's a pretty small table. I mean, are you going to have thousands and thousands of users? Hopefully, that's not the way your application is designed. You know, if the purpose of the database is to have 1,000 users and they're not in a particular application table, and that's a good, smart, good decision, then yeah, it's going to be really impactful. But if you have, say, 100 users and permissions, that's great. The other thing is you can use wildcards and things like hosts. So you can say everyone on this subnet. You can also use subnets like, you know, 16.12.0.0/24 if you want. So you can actually, you don't actually need to have like every host and every, you know, thing. You can use %, as the wildcard symbol, or an underscore as one wildcard character. So you shouldn't have to have that much. And in MySQL, it will impact performance. I have to think that it will impact no matter what, because when you go into a shell like SQL Plus, a database shell, and you're connected, it has to test to make sure that you have those privileges. I know MySQL actually tests the authentication information, the whole, like, you have a key and it sends it over and it's like, okay, you did authenticate, and now, you know, okay, can you get this table? Yes. And even if you've gotten the table before, it'll look to see, okay, do they have access to the table now? Any other actual questions? Yes, you in the front. I'll get you.
Can you provide an opinion on whether or not it's better, like say if you had a sensitive operation like encrypting credit card numbers, would you rather see that in the application space, or would you want to push it off to a procedural language in, say, the PDMS space?
Well, let me get to my notes on that, because I want to make sure that I get everything that I want to say on that. The opinion is there's pros and cons. So the question is, if you have some sensitive like algorithm like encrypting your passwords, is it better to have it in the code, or is it better to have it in the stored procedure? You know, or hey, is it better to have it like as close to the user as possible, like in JavaScript or something, right? So that way it only transmits across the wire encrypted or something. That he didn't say that. I made that crappy part up, as you could tell. And the answer is it really depends, because the problem with that kind of thing is when you back up your data, are you backing up your algorithms and your code in the same place? You know, what are your policies on that? If your policy is, well, the backups are really secure, they're with, you know, Iron Mountain and we're not going to worry about it, then great. The other problem is that that database code is kind of a black box, which is a good thing and a bad thing. So you can say to the developers, okay, you know, run this query, you know, delete user, or run this query encrypt password. And they don't have to know how it works underneath, which means that you can make performance really fast. The database administrator can be in charge of changing that, fixing that. But that's kind of a double-edged sword, because then you don't necessarily have the same testing procedures. Even in shops that have a lot of, you know, PLSQL, there's not really a lot of source control. And I mean, some shops do have it, some shops don't, but most of the time it's like database administrator waves their hands and black magic happens, and ooh, we've got this function, and now it's faster, and now they say it's more secure. So the answer is it depends, but those are the factors involved. Did that answer your question? Does anyone have any other factors that might be involved there? Super. You in the back that stood up before, and I'll get you.
This is great. I would really love it if my developers developed their applications with user authentication in the database.
Okay.
In 15 years in the business, I've never seen any developer I've ever worked with do this. It's always their application logs into the database with a static user, and they create their own user tables within their application database, authenticate the users that way. They do all their rights management within the application, how do we convince our developers to trust the freaking database and use the database, user tables and grants and ACLs, rather than rolling their own in their app? Because then this happens in web apps, this happens in three-tiered systems. You know, everywhere I've ever been, I've seen this happen over and over again.
Right. It depends what extreme you take it to. First, you have to convince your developers and your database administrators to get along. In fact, you know, I was talking to somebody yesterday, like, oh, you're speaking a green badge. What are you talking about? Well, I'm talking about why our database is so hard to secure. And no shit, what he told me was, well, that's, you know, why our database is so hard to secure. They're so hard to secure because DBAs are stupid. And I was like, well, super. Like, A, I'm a DBA. B, do you know how many times I hear from the DBA, like the DBAs hate the developers and the DBAs, like it's a systems problem, it's a code problem, it's a this problem. You all have to work together. That's all I have to say. We all have to work together, right? So part of it is getting whatever policies you have for user management, if you wanted to go that route, which is a good route, right? Because it's already a problem that's been solved by the database management system. Oracle's already solved that problem of how to do user auth. MySQL solved that problem. Postgres solved that problem. SQL Server solved that problem. Now, Microsoft SQL Server is an interesting beast because you have to have a login on the box to have a login to the database. You don't actually have to be able to have a shell on it, but you have to use some kind of authentication if it's, you know, on the box or Active Directory or something. It has to exist. So that's something that SQL Server is not so great at. Again, though, you can have, you know, it's kind of like on Unix where you have a shell account for Apache, but you don't give it, you give it bin false as the login. So it's not like the worst security vulnerability in the world. But, you know, and again, now you have to deal with your Windows admins, you know, the sysadmins. So it's a hard problem to solve because now you have to involve a lot of groups as opposed to the developers who are like, yeah, no, we'll just create this table and we'll do this and they'll be fine. The other problem is that so if there's some web app or whatever, and you know, so now I have a login and you have a login, are you going to give me and you different tables so that I can't see your table and you can't see my table? Like, how many thousands of databases and tables are you going to create then? That's going to create a lot of overhead. With a lot of these database management systems, when you look at a table, you're opening a file. So there's only so many file descriptors you have on the system. So you can bork yourself that way, and that's probably why. I mean, the answer is, I think, because it's too hard. That doesn't mean it's impossible, but it just means that.
How often do you see it actually implemented, like you talked about?
Never. Never. I have never seen it happen that way. Certainly not for like a web app or whatever. And it's hard because then you have to manage all of those. It's really hard. Certainly. I've also seen people try to be smart about it and say, well, here's the web app user that can write the permissions, and here's the web app user that can read the permissions, and we're going to use this user for this and that user for that. But guess what? They're stored in the same config file. So, I mean, you know, what happens if you break into Apache or you break into the IIS user? Now you're, well, not that Apache's ever had any vulnerabilities, ever. Right? So you break in and you become